June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. A game of checkers lay half-finished when Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald lifted his eyes from the board. The man at the screen door had given his name, but it hadn't fully registered. MacDonald's attention remained on his opponent, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, operations officer for Satan's Angels. The civilian repeated his introduction with a steady assurance that made MacDonald look up. Charles Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, America's best-known aviator, stood in a makeshift recreation hall thousands of miles from home, asking to talk about P-38 combat operations. Neither man realized that this interruption would append long-range fighter tactics in the Pacific. Over the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach methods that increased the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 meters, turning what pilots once called impossible into everyday procedure. The account of how a civilian consultant doubled the effective reach of America's leading twin-engine fighter is more than a technical footnote. It is the story of institutional reluctance, broken by undeniable proof, of aircrews learning to trust calculation over gut instinct, and of one expert's command of fuel economy reshaping aerial warfare in the Pacific. The equations for extended range were not drafted in manuals, but discovered at the controls by pilots who found that their engine management training was incomplete. The impossible was becoming routine, and the instructor was a 42-year-old civilian who had flown a P-38 for the first time only 3 days earlier. The route that ended at that screen door in Hollandia began 17 years before, over the Atlantic dot between May 20th and 21st, 1927. Charles Augustus Lindbergh changed aviation forever by flying solo from New York to Paris, covering 3,600 meters in 33 12 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he piloted, Spirit of St. Louis, carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they obstructed forward vision. Lindbergh navigated with a periscope in dead reckoning and managed fuel with a level of precision that other pilots of the day would have called paranoid. He touched down at Laborfield with 85 gallons still aboard, achieving fuel economy that experts had deemed impossible for a Wright whirlwind radial engine. That exacting attention to fuel use became Lindbergh's signature technical skill. Through the 1930s, as he flew survey missions for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh refined methods that pushed aircraft far past manufacturer range figures. He recognized that published range numbers were averages, not absolute limits. Every engine had an optimal operating envelope, where power output, fuel burn, and mechanical stress balanced. Finding that envelope demanded a deeper understanding of how manifold pressure, propeller, RPM, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed interacted, knowledge that standard training did not cover. By 1944, Lindbergh was regarded as one of the world's authorities on long-range flight, but his relationship with the U.S. military was fraught because of his pre-war isolationism. He had vigorously opposed American involvement in European conflicts, led the America First Committee, and earned President Franklin Roosevelt's hostility. On April 29, 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to Civil War Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his ERO Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor drew America into war, Lindbergh tried to rejoin the Army Air Corps, but Roosevelt ensured he would not wear a U.S. military uniform again during the conflict. Nevertheless, his expertise found a path forward. Barred from military service, Lindbergh worked as a civilian technical consultant for aircraft manufacturers, joining United Aircraft Corporation in 1943 and spending much of his time with their Chancefault division, makers of the F-4U Corsair. He worked at Ford's Willow Run plant solving production snags on the B-24 Liberator, flew perilous high-altitude engine tests in P-47 Thunderbolts, and helped devise dive bombing procedures for the Corsair. His technical impact was substantial, yet Lindbergh longed for active service. By early 1944, he spotted an opening. United Aircraft was evaluating a twin-engine fighter, and the only American example in that class was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. He persuaded United Aircraft to send him to the Pacific as a civilian technical representative to watch P-38s operate under combat conditions. On April 3, 1944, he prepared to deploy to the South Pacific, stopping at Brooks Brothers in New York to buy a naval officer's uniform stripped of insignia. At Brentano's, he purchased a small New Testament and noted in his journal that since he could carry only one very small book, that was his choice. A decade earlier, he might have chosen differently. But the more he learned, the fewer competitors the New Testament had for his attention. He left San Diego on April 24th, officially bound for Marine aviation bases around Guadalcanal. The Navy Department authorized the trip but kept it from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, were told. Lindbergh was heading into the war zone. What began as a simple observation role grew when Marine aviation officers invited Lindbergh to fly along on combat sorties. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first combat sortie, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rebiel. though the mission was labeled observation. Lindbergh kept his guns hot and engaged targets when chances presented themselves. He quickly proved he could turn theory into practice. Working with Corsair pilots, he demonstrated how to take off safely with bomb loads double the F-4U's nominal rating. The Marines had been losing aircraft in overweight takeoffs, and Lindbergh's careful calculations of power settings, rotation speeds, and load distribution cut accidents, while expanding strike capability. Word spread across the Pacific that the famed aviator was flying combat missions as a civilian and solving operational problems that had baffled military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh's curiosity turned to the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was real, and Lindbergh had heard that the 475th Fighter Group Satan's Angels was one of the most active Lightning units in the theater. If he wanted to study the P-38 in action, that was where to go. On June 15, 1944, he hitched a ride to Finch in New Guinea and reported to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadsab, where he lunched with Colonel Marion Cooper. On the evening of Sunday, June 18, he dined with General Ennis Whitehead, discussing developments in New Guinea and his plans to observe P-38 operations. The authorization he received was informal and would not pass strict military scrutiny, but in the fluid command environment of the Southwest Pacific, personal contacts and proven competence often outweighed paperwork. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent an hour and 20 minutes being checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group, his first time in the distinctive twin-boom fighter. On June 26th, he flew to Hollandia and walked into Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald, 29, and already credited with 10 victories, commanded the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and had become one of the theater's highest-scoring P-38 units. The group's 431st, 432nd, and 433rd Squadrons flew the latest P-38J models fitted with improved intercoolers and extra fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, tasked with missions no other fighters could reach. Still, even with drop tanks, the P-38's effective radius was limited. Long range missions left little fuel for combat maneuvering. Pilots often returned with dangerously low reserves, and several planes had been lost when weather forced detours that exceeded fuel endurance. MacDonald initially acknowledged Lindbergh curtly and went back to his game. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had sent him to consult on P-38 combat work, MacDonald took notice. After a short conversation, MacDonald invited Lindbergh to fly a mission the next morning. Lindbergh accepted, and the sortie was scheduled for dawn. To avoid travel hassles, MacDonald suggested Lindbergh remain at the 475th camp rather than return to headquarters. As Lindbergh settled into a spare cot, word spread through the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. Pilots' reactions varied. Lieutenant John Purdy of the 433rd looked forward to meeting the legend, while others were doubtful, questioning whether a 42-year-old civilian, famous though he was, could handle the demands of modern combat. Major Thomas Maguire, already a 15-victory ace, who would end the war as America's second highest scoring fighter pilot with 38 confirmed kills, was eager to see what the veteran could do. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh readied himself for his first combat sortie in a P-38. Rain fell steadily at 0530 hours, but conditions improved by 10:30 when the flight finally departed. MacDonald lead for Lightnings toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, routine objectives for the 475th. Lindbergh rode as Blue 3 on Maguire's wing. Another ship in the flight was flown by Merrill Smith, an 8-victory ace. MacDonald watched as Lindbergh slipped neatly into formation on Maguire's wing, remarkable for a man who had flown the type only days before. The mission called for strafing an enemy barge in Kibos Bay. Lindbergh threaded his way through anti-aircraft fire, his cannon and machine guns tearing into the target. The attack succeeded and all 4 fighters returned intact. But what the ground crews noticed after shutdown proved more consequential than any combat claim. After inspecting Lindbergh's P-38 following several missions, the crew chiefs found a pattern. His airplane consistently came home with substantially more fuel than other pilots who had flown the same sorties. On July 1st, after a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance along the western shore of Gilvink Bay, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons aboard, while others from that mission reported tanks nearly dry. 2 days later, the group escorted 16 B-25s in a strike on Jeffman Island and then hunted barges. Within an hour, 2 pilots broke off with low fuel, but Lindbergh continued and still had comfortable reserves. MacDonald took note of the discrepancy and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel assembled the 475th's pilots in the crude recreation hala packed dirt floor under a palm-thatched roof with 1 ping-pong table and a few decks of cards. Under harsh, unshaded bulbs, McDonald formally introduced Lindbergh and asked him to explain how he kept returning with more fuel than anyone else. What Lindbergh said next would alter P-38 operations across the theater. Lindbergh outlined cruise control techniques he had worked out for the Lightning. Standard procedure taught P-38 pilots to cruise at 2,200 to 2,400 RPM with a mixture set to Outrun combination that produced reliable power and was considered safe for the engines, but burned fuel lavishly. Lindbergh argued that by cutting engine speed to 1,600 RPM and switching the mixture to Outrun instead of Outrun and slightly increasing manifold pressure to offset the lower RPM, pilots could sharply reduce fuel burn without sacrificing effective cruise speed. He recommended specific settings: 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, mixture on Outrun, and an indicated airspeed of about 185 miles per hour, which he said dropped fuel consumption to roughly 70 gallons and produced about 2.6 miles per gallon. Lindbergh predicted those settings would extend the Lightning's radius by 400 miles, making 9-hour missions feasible. When he finished a half hour later, the room fell quiet. The pilots wrestled with several unsettling realities. The idea of a night patrol appalled men already strained by 7-hour missions. The P-38 cockpit was cramped, with parachutes, an emergency raft, and gear jammed into the tiny compartment, and survival suits were miserably uncomfortable. Even more troubling was that Lindbergh was advocating an engine regime they had been taught to avoid: low RPM combined with high manifold pressure known as running over square. Military instruction warned that over-square operation caused detonation, overheated cylinder heads, and catastrophic engine failure. Pilots had been drilled to believe that manifold pressure, exceeding RPM by more than a few inches, risked blowing the engine. Now a civilian was telling them to do precisely that. Skepticism was palpable. Some pilots exchanged wary looks. Others shook their heads, and at least one bluntly called the method dangerous. McDonald saw the difference between theory and practice. Lindbergh was speaking from repeated combat flights using these settings. His P-38 had shown no engine trouble, and the extra fuel had given him operational options the others lacked. The colonel decided to test the technique in the field. If it worked, the 475th would gain a decisive advantage. If not, they would discover the risk quickly. Over the next week, pilots began cautiously to try Lindbergh's cruise regimen. Early sorties were short so they could turn back at the first sign of trouble. The first evaluators reported only that the Allison V1710 sounded different at the lower RPM. The deep rumble change butt gauges remained reassuring. Temperatures stayed normal. Oil pressure stayed within limits, and the critical cylinder head readings ran cooler than at higher RPM. As confidence increased, crews began employing the settings on longer missions. The fuel savings were unmistakable. Flights that once required an immediate return could now add extended combat air patrol time, and missions that had ended with dangerously low tanks began finishing with comfortable reserves. The P-38's nose armament, a single 20mm cannon flanked by .50 caliber machine guns, erupted in a 6-second pass as Lindbergh held the trigger. Projectiles tore into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly slowed and smoke began pouring from the engine, yet Captain Saburo Shimada maintained his heading until the last instant. Lindbergh yanked the Lightning upward, clearing the crippled Sonya by only a few feet as the enemy aircraft went into a steep dive. Other P-38s added bursts while the Sonya fell trailing smoke, striking the sea at high speed and sending a white plume of spray outward that settled back into the water. Shimada and his observer did not survive. Back at camp, the men compared accounts. Several pilots had fired on the Sonya, McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh among them, but it was Lindbergh's head-on volley that had slowed the prop and set the fatal dive in motion. Privately, the pilots conceded the kill to Lindbergh, though it was never entered in the 475th's official records. As a civilian flying irregularly in combat, logging a formal victory might have jeopardized his presence with the group. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly lost his life during a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands when the flight ran into Japanese Zeros. In a turning fight, a Zero came close to shooting him down. Only McDonald's order, brake right, and McDonald's subsequent engagement of the attacker pulled Lindbergh out of immediate danger. That close call convinced 5th Air Force Headquarters that Lindbergh had already proven the value of his methods and that his continued exposure to combat was too risky. By then, Lindbergh had flown roughly 50 combat sorties in the Pacific, about 25 of them in P-38s with the 475th. He had downed an enemy plane and narrowly escaped death. It was time to bring him home. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh departed Hollandia for the United States. The pilots of the 475th assembled to bid him farewell, their regard unmistakable. He had not only taught them techniques that broadened their operational reach, he had flown and fought alongside them, earning respect where rank and fame counted for nothing. Lindbergh's fuel-saving regimen spread rapidly. By October 1944, P-38 units across the Pacific had adopted versions of his cruise control ideas. Exact settings varied with aircraft and conditions, but the basic formula held. Lower RPM increased. Manifold pressure and a leaner mixture combined to produce a dramatic increase in range. The operational consequences were striking targets once beyond fighter reach became accessible. Japanese bases that had enjoyed refuge from escorts now faced Lightnings with the fuel to fight over the objective and still return. Fighters could, finally, escort bombers on missions that had earlier gone unprotected. Long-range sweeps penetrated deeper into enemy-held territory. Groups operating from Dutch New Guinea routinely flew 950-mile missions, engaged for a quarter hour or so, and returned missions that had been unthinkable before these techniques were adopted. The range gains had strategic effects as well as tactical ones. In the second half of 1944, the enlarged combat radius directly supported MacArthur's push toward the Philippines. Airfields previously unusable for fighter cover became viable forward bases, and invasions that might have been delayed to wait for closer air support could move forward more swiftly. The payoff was measured in miles gained and weeks saved. Campaigns that might have stretched out over months tightened into faster operations because fighter protection could reach farther. Sooner. The technique also saved lives. Pilots who once returned with near-empty tanks now carried reserves for diversion or emergency. Weather detours no longer guaranteed loss, and crews who suffered battle damage had a better chance of reaching safety. The extra fuel margin reduced non-combat aircraft losses and improved survival odds in many engagements. Adoption was not universal or uncontested. Some commanders worried about engine wear and reliability. Skeptical pilots clung to orthodox training, and maintenance officers fretted over potential stresses on power. Yet the empirical record was persuasive. Units using Lindbergh's methods reported no rise in engine failures, logged marked reductions in fuel burn, and filed mission reports documenting operations that simply had not been possible before. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control procedure had been absorbed into official P-38 operating practice. What began as a civilian observer's recommendations became formal doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces issued revised cruise control charts incorporating his findings and training. Materials were updated to teach proper lean-of-peak mixture operation. Lindbergh's story behind those technical gains was complicated. His pre-war isolationism had made him a contentious public figure. Remarks about German aviation technology and his outspoken opposition to American entry into the European war had cost him favor in Washington and left him estranged from President Roosevelt. Yet far from the capital, in the Southwest Pacific, Lindbergh found a different verdict. Pilots judged him by his flying and his results rather than by political headlines. Praise from leading combat aviators carried weight. Major Richard Bong, the nation's top ace, told reporters that Lindbergh could match any of us in the air, and would have been knocking off enemy aircraft every day if he'd been permitted to do so, which mattered more to Lindbergh's reputation than any attempt at political rehabilitation. After his Mittelgas 1944 return to the United States, Lindbergh kept contributing technically to the war effort. In October, he took part in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, flew and evaluated captured Japanese types to assess enemy capabilities, and continued consulting for United Aircraft and other firms to troubleshoot combat problems. The technical scale of his achievement is striking. The P-38 Lightning carried roughly 410 gallons of internal fuel in its standard arrangement to 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserve tanks, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks with provisions for external drop tanks that pushed total capacity past 1,000 gallons. At the conventional cruise setting of about 2,200 RPM with an Auteric mixture, fuel burn was markedly higher than what Lindbergh demonstrated in practice. His cruise regimen cut consumption to roughly 70 gallons per hour overall, raising the combat radius from about 570 miles to roughly 750 miles with the same combat and reserve allowances, a gain on the order of 31%. For missions that demanded the absolute maximum range, combining drop tanks with his cruise techniques made flights approaching 9 hours and more than 1,000 miles feasible, a capability that reshaped Pacific operations. Those range improvements changed strategy. MacArthur's island-hopping advance depended on fighter coverage. The distance fighters could reach determined which islands had to be seized and which could be bypassed. By stretching fighter endurance, Lindbergh's methods permitted more ambitious plans. Some islands that would otherwise have required costly amphibious assaults could be left out of the line because fighters could reach targets from farther bases. That faster operational reach shortened campaign timelines and accelerated the advance into the Philippines. It is worth noting a common historical error. The April 1943 interception that killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did push P-38 range limits, but Lindbergh was not involved. He did not arrive in the theater until a year later. His contribution lay in making extreme-range missions routine rather than exceptional. The human side of the story matters. Lindbergh was 42 when he deployed, flying against opponents often 20 years his junior and enduring the physical toll of high-G maneuvering, combat stress, and cramped 7 to 9-hour stints in a tiny cockpit. He asked for no special privileges. However, he flew the same missions, accepted the same risks, and proved his techniques by personal example. Had he stayed at headquarters and lectured, pilots might have dismissed him as a theorist. By flying and repeatedly demonstrating the results, he gained the credibility that rank or celebrity alone could not buy. Asterisk, there was also a broader institutional effect. Lindbergh showed that specialized civilian technical knowledge could materially improve combat performance. While militaries naturally value rank and combat experience, modern warfare increasingly required outside technical sophistication. His success encouraged commanders to take civilian technical representatives seriously, improving collaboration between frontline users and designers and speeding technical innovation during the war. Finally, the P-38 itself made the experiments practical. Its twin-engine layout provided a safety margin that made trials less risky. The Allison V1710 engines proved responsive to careful mixture management, and the Lightning's multiple tanks and transfer system allowed fine control of fuel distribution. The airplane's stability and endurance suited long cruise legs. Although in late 1944 and early 1945, the P-38 began to yield some roles to the P-51, Mustang especially at high altitude, Lightning remained indispensable in the Pacific because its twin-engine redundancy provided extra security over long stretches of water. The Lightning packed fearsome firepower. Its handling at low to medium altitudes matched the demands of Pacific combat, and its endurance, especially when piloted using Lindbergh's methods, remained remarkable. The numbers tell the story. The 475th Fighter Group, operating P-38s exclusively, claimed 551 aerial victories, the highest total for any P-38 unit in the war. Major Thomas McGuire, America's second highest scoring ace with 38 victories, flew with the 475th. The airplane's mix of range weapons and dependability made it the theater's dominant fighter, and the extra reach Lindbergh's techniques provided amplified every mission. Crews could go farther, fight longer, and come home with safer fuel margins. Over thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, the cumulative effect was vast, if not easily reduced to a single number. The episode also exposed the awkward fit between expertise and military bureaucracy. Lindbergh's pre-war political stances had made him unwelcome for commissioned service and earned President Roosevelt's disfavor. Yet the Army Air Forces needed his technical skill, the informal solution on unofficial civilian operating with tacit permission to fly combat missions would likely violate today's rules. But in practice, necessity trumped paperwork and operational pragmatism prevailed, producing clear benefits for the war effort. Those who served with him never forgot what he taught. In later interviews, former 475th pilots spoke respectfully of the civilian who had flown beside them and showed them how to extend their reach. Colonel Warren Lewis, who commanded the 432nd Squadron, could recall Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings decades on. Details varied across accounts as crews adapted numbers to aircraft and conditions, but the central idea held, and the results were unmistakable. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, aged 72, of lymphoma at his home in Kipahu, Maui. He had quietly left Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17 and reached Maui about a week before his death. He was buried roughly 3 hours after he died in a plain handmade coffin built by local ranch hands in work clothes, placed in a 30-foot deep grave lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles at Palapalahu Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended. The marker is a simple concrete slab inscribed with a line from Psalm 139. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. His wartime journals, published in 1970, offer detailed accounts of his specific service, including his time with the 475th. Lindbergh's specific contribution went beyond cockpit recipes. He proved several enduring truths. Technical expertise matters in combat. Civilian specialists can make essential contributions if granted access. Institutional procedures should be questioned when empirical evidence supports change. And showing a method in action convinces far more effectively than arguing abstractly. Above all, he underscored that even mature systems usually have room for improvement. At its core, his achievement was the meeting of rare skill and pressing operational need. The Pacific Campaign demanded extreme fighter endurance, and existing procedures kept performance below what the aircraft could deliver. Lindbergh brought decades of focus on fuel efficiency to a theater where results could be measured, risked his life to demonstrate his ideas, and worked alongside pilots rather than lecturing from safety. That combination unlocked capabilities already present in the P-38. For 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught some of the Pacific's finest Fighter pilots' techniques they passed on to others, spreading practices that changed how the United States prosecuted the air war in the region. His contribution did not come from a laboratory but from one man's mastery of an art he began perfecting over the Atlantic in 1927. Applied to different aircraft and conditions in 1944, that mastery proved equally valuable. The principle stayed the same: know the airplane completely, manage resources precisely, and treat published limits as starting points rather than immovable boundaries. The pilots of Satan's angels left knowing they could fly farther, fight longer, and return safer because a civilian had shown them how, and that knowledge, proven in combat and adopted across the theater, ranks among the most consequential technical innovations of the Pacific Air War.